What's going on, everybody? Kalubis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking another look at the BLU 3 and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy in 2023. Now, this phone isn't available through a lot of different carriers, but I know at least TracFone and Straight Talk still have it. And for what it is, especially considering how cheap and low-end its predecessor was, the BLU 3 is actually a surprisingly decent phone. So we're going to revisit this phone's specs and features to give you a better idea of whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the BLU 3, unlike most phones you can get for less than $100, we're actually getting a pretty nice display here. At 6 inches, while not being the largest display out there, I would say in general it's a pretty good size, being big enough to give you a decent experience when you're doing stuff like browsing the web, but also compact enough to still be comfortable to use. With an 18:9 aspect ratio, the form factor isn't really bad, maybe a little bit shorter and wider than the average phone nowadays, but again, it's still really not too bad. And aside from the size and dimensions, for what it is, the image quality itself is actually pretty decent. This display is an IPS LCD, and we are getting a 720p resolution with a PPI of 268. Now, despite only having a 720p resolution, things are decently sharp, and I feel like in general, while with a phone like this, we're obviously not getting the most amazing image ever, nor would I expect to in this price range, but for more casual use, for stuff like occasional web browsing and social media use, or maybe even watching the odd video every now and then, I do think what we're getting here will be good enough for that. Now for storage, this phone is getting 32GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so unfortunately this really isn't a whole lot. At this point in 2023, I feel like 64GB is really a bare minimum, and even then, if you're downloading tons of apps, especially stuff like games, even 64GB will fill up pretty quickly. But with 32, you're really getting hardly any space here, so unless you're a really light user and you only have a few apps on your phone, you probably are going to want more space than this. But to be fair, this is a really low-end phone, and phones under $100, or even just around this price range in general, tend to have significantly less storage than the average phone, and at least we are getting microSD card expansion here, so if you have a lot of photos and videos or maybe some music, you can always put those things on a microSD card, and that will help. But again, in general, for the average user, with only 32GB of internal storage, for most people this is probably not going to be enough. Now for security features, unfortunately this phone doesn't have a fingerprint scanner or face unlock, which is really too bad, because in this day and age, I feel like most phones, even the really low-end ones, have at least a fingerprint scanner or face unlock, and even then most of them actually have both. So seeing a phone like this in 2023 that doesn't have either is definitely a bit of a letdown. That being said, I guess not everyone really wants a fingerprint scanner or face unlock, so if you are one of those people, if you really just don't care, then this might not be a big deal, but I feel like for most people, having at least a fingerprint scanner or face unlock is nice. So if you do care about these features, then again, definitely keep in mind, this phone doesn't have either. Now for the camera setup, this phone is honestly pretty featureless. For the front-facing camera, we got an 8-megapixel camera right here on the bezel. Then on the back, we got a single camera, and this camera is 13 megapixels. So to be fair, the actual photo quality really isn't horrible. I mean, sure, if you're taking a lot of pictures, maybe you're a content creator of some sort, you're definitely going to want a much better camera than this. But if you're just taking the occasional regular photo every now and then, maybe to put on social media for example, it will at least be good enough for that. But that being said, as far as the actual features go, as you can see, this phone doesn't really have a whole lot of anything. No ultra-wide camera, no macro camera, not even a depth sensing camera, although to be fair, portrait mode actually still does work, so I guess that's not too big a deal. But in general, on one hand, if you're really hardly using your camera, but you still want to get a couple nice photos every now and then, this phone will at least get the job done. But if you're taking a lot of pictures, and maybe you want really actually good photo quality and a wider variety of features, in that case, this is definitely not going to be the phone for you. Now as far as the RAM and processor go, with the BLU 3, we're getting 3GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio P22 processor. Now seeing as this is a really cheap low-end phone that, as you've probably noticed, doesn't really have a ton of features, you might expect the performance to be pretty bad too. But surprisingly, this really isn't the case. Sure, on one hand, this really isn't a fast phone per se, but for more basic activities, like web browsing, social media, stuff like that, as long as you're not going to be on your phone all the time, and you don't expect 5G connectivity or lightning fast speed or anything, I feel like it will get the job done just fine. I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on it, and here are the scores I got. So again, definitely not the fastest phone out there, but compared to most phones in this price range, which again is about $70, I would say this phone is in general on the faster side. So if you are looking for a really affordable entry-level phone, and you don't really need to do too terribly much on it, then in general, I do think the performance we get with the BLU 3 will at least be good enough for you. For the battery, this phone has a 3400 mAh battery, and on one hand, this really isn't very impressive at all, especially considering, as far as I know, it doesn't support fast charging, and the charging speeds aren't really great either. So while this is probably not going to be the best phone for you if you're looking for a phone specifically with a really good battery, if you just want something decent that works, it will at least be okay. Now, one weird thing I do want to point out here is that on one hand, with this phone, you can take the back off. In fact, to get to the microSD card and the SIM card, you actually do have to do this. And in case you're wondering, to take the back off, pull on this little tab right here. The back is going to come right off. So there we go. This is where you put the SIM card. and the microSD card. But unfortunately, as you can see, the battery is actually not removable, despite being able to take the back off. So in case you're wondering, while some really low-end phones like this do actually have the benefit of being able to easily replace the battery, unfortunately this phone doesn't. But again, all the same, with the 3400 mAh battery, while it's definitely not a very big battery, in my experience, the battery life you get here is at least decent. Now as far as the software goes, this phone does unfortunately only have Android 11, and considering this is a really low-end phone, I'm pretty sure we're not going to be getting any major updates either. So if you are more concerned with having the latest software, then this is definitely not going to be the phone for you. But in general, with really entry-level phones like this, typically the software and updates really aren't the best, so I'm not too surprised here. But if you don't really care a whole lot about the software, just keep in mind, Android 11 is at least decently optimized on this phone, so I don't really have a whole lot of complaints here. Another thing to keep in mind is that unfortunately, this phone does not have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, definitely keep this in mind, because you won't be able to do that with this phone. Now, am I really surprised by this? Not really. Sure, more and more really affordable phones are starting to get NFC in 2023, but seeing as this phone was released in 2022, and after all, it is a really entry-level phone, as far as other features like NFC go, we can only really expect so much. As far as the overall design and materials go, this phone is actually surprisingly good. Sure, it is pretty much made entirely of cheap plastic, but the build quality does feel really sturdy. The phone itself doesn't feel like it's about to fall apart, and it actually does have a surprising amount of weight to it. So in general, while this phone doesn't look or feel premium by any means, it at least does have decent materials and build quality, so in general, definitely a solid device here. But in conclusion, is the BLU View 3 still a good phone to buy in 2023? In general, the short answer here is yes, I do think it's still worth considering for some people. Sure, if you're looking for a great camera, an amazing display, tons of storage, super fast performance, and a ton of features, this is definitely not going to be the phone for you. But if you're just looking for a really basic, affordable device that has at least decent build quality and battery life, and at least has enough processing power to get the job done without feeling super slow, then in that kind of situation, if you really just need the bare minimum, I feel like the BLU View 3 is still a perfectly fine device, and for the money, there's not really a whole lot more I could ask for. So yeah, again, in general, if you're looking for a really basic, affordable device, then for now, I do think the BLU View 3 is still going to be a perfectly fine option. And based on past years, I imagine that later in 2023, we'll most likely even see a successor to this phone that could possibly be even better. Now, once again, in case you want to learn more about this device, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories, so definitely check that out if you're interested. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.